Welcome to Fairy World. The weight of names. In the kingdom of Nomara, names were not light things that floated on the air when spoken. They were heavy, solid, real. Every person born in this land received their name at birth, and with it came a wooden box crafted by the finest carpenters in the realm. These boxes hung from leather straps that people wore across their shoulders, and inside each box rested their name, carved into a smooth stone. The weight of each name was different. Some names were as light as pebbles, easy to carry through life. Others were heavy as river rocks, causing their bearers to walk with a slight lean to one side. The people of Nomara had learned to live this way for generations, and to them it seemed as natural as breathing. In the capital city of Veradin, where the castle towers reached toward the clouds and the market squares bustled with merchants and performers, there lived a young woman named Lark. Her name box was made of pale birch wood, worn smooth by years of handling, and it hung comfortably at her hip. The weight of her name was modest, about as heavy as a large apple, and she barely noticed it anymore as she moved through her daily life. Lark worked in the market as a cloth merchant's assistant, measuring fabric and wrapping purchases for customers. She had dark hair that she kept tied back with a simple ribbon, and curious eyes that noticed things others often missed. It was this quality, this habit of watching and noticing, that first brought the name thief to her attention. His name, if anyone had known it, was Felix, though he kept his name box hidden beneath his long coat where no one could see it. Felix had been stealing names for 3 years, moving from village to village, town to town, always staying ahead of the law. He was thin and quick, with clever fingers and a face that people forgot as soon as he left a room. He had learned that being forgettable was the greatest advantage a thief could have. Names could be sold, though it was deeply illegal. There were collectors in the underground markets who paid well for unusual names, old names, names with particular weights or histories. But Felix was not interested in ordinary theft anymore. He had grown ambitious. He wanted the heaviest name in all of Nomara, and he knew exactly whose name that was. King Aldrich VII had ruled Nomara for 42 years. He was an old man now, with a beard that had gone from gold to silver to white, and hands that trembled slightly when he held his scepter. But what everyone in the kingdom knew about King Aldrich was the extraordinary weight of his name. His name box was made of reinforced oak, banded with iron, and it required a special padded harness to carry. 2 servants were assigned to help the king put on his name box each morning, and even then he walked slowly, carefully, bearing the weight with visible effort. People said the king's name was heavy with pride, with the weight of his lineage and his achievements. After all, he had expanded the kingdom's borders, brought prosperity to his people, and maintained peace for 4 decades. Such glory must surely add weight to a name, the people reasoned. The heaviest name in the land belonged to the greatest king they had ever known. Felix had spent months planning how to steal King Aldrich's name. He studied the castle routines, bribed servants for information, and learned the layout of the royal chambers. He discovered that every night the king removed his name box and placed it on a special stand beside his bed, a stand made of stone that could bear the tremendous weight. 2 guards stood outside the king's chamber, but none stood inside, for who would dare enter the king's own bedroom? On a night when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, Felix made his move. He had climbed many walls in his career as a thief, and the castle wall, though high, offered enough handholds for someone who knew what to look for. He entered through a window in an unused tower and made his way through silent corridors, avoiding the guards with practiced ease. The king's chamber door was locked, but Felix had long ago learned to open locks with nothing more than a bent wire and patience. The soft click of the mechanism seemed loud in the quiet hallway, but the guards at the end of the corridor did not turn. Felix slipped inside and closed the door behind him. The room was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace. King Aldrich slept in his great canopied bed, his breathing deep and steady. And there, on the stone stand, was the name box. Even in the dim light, Felix could see how substantial it was, how the iron bands gleamed dully against the dark wood. Felix approached slowly, his heart pounding. This was the moment his entire career had been leading to. He reached out and grasped the leather handles of the name box harness, preparing himself for the weight. He had brought special padding to wear beneath the straps, knowing it would be heavy. But nothing could have prepared him for what he felt when he lifted the king's name. The weight crashed into him like a physical blow. His knees buckled and he nearly fell, catching himself against the stone stand at the last moment. It was not just heavy. It was impossibly, unbearably heavy, as if he were trying to lift the entire castle itself. His shoulders screamed in protest, his back bent under the strain, and for a moment he thought he would have to abandon his plan, leave the name where it was, and flee. But Felix was nothing if not stubborn. He had not come this far to fail. He adjusted the harness, distributing the weight as best he could, and began the agonizing journey back through the castle. Every step was torture. His legs shook with effort, sweat poured down his face, and twice he had to stop and rest, setting the name box down as gently as he could to avoid making noise. He did not know how he made it out of the castle. Later, he would barely remember the climb down the wall, the way his fingers bled as he clung to the stone with one hand while supporting the terrible weight of the name box with the other. But somehow, as dawn began to paint the eastern sky pale gray, Felix found himself in the forest outside the city, collapsing beneath a large oak tree with the king's name still strapped to his back. He lay there gasping for perhaps an hour, unable to move. Every part of his body hurt, but as his breathing steadied and his strength slowly returned, a new feeling crept over him. It was not pride at having succeeded in the greatest theft of his life. It was not excitement about the fortune he would make when he sold this name. It was something else, entirely. Something he had never experienced before. It was sorrow, deep, profound, crushing sorrow that seemed to well up from the name box itself and seep into his very bones. Felix sat up slowly and looked at the box where it rested on the ground beside him. For the first time, he truly studied it. The oak wood was not just worn, it was scarred, marked with tiny scratches and dents. The iron bands were tarnished, and in some places they looked corroded as if by salt water or tears. Felix reached out with trembling fingers and unlatched the box. It was a violation, opening someone's name box. In Nomara, a person's name was the most private thing they possessed. Children were taught from the earliest age never to open another's name box, never to look upon another's name-stone without permission. But Felix was already a thief, already damned by the laws of the land. What was one more transgression? The lid lifted with a creak of hinges, and Felix looked inside. The name-stone was larger than any he had ever seen, roughly the size of 2 fists placed together, and so dark it was almost black. But it was not the size or color that made Felix gasp. It was what he saw carved into the stone. There were words, so many words that they covered every inch of the stone in tiny, precise script. Felix lifted the stone from its box, staggering again at its weight, and turned it in the morning light to read what was written there. These were not titles. They were not achievements or victories or proud declarations of glory. They were names, other people's names, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, carved in letters so small they were almost too tiny to read. Felix squinted, bringing the stone closer to his face, and began to read at random. Elira, beloved wife, taken by fever in the 13th year of reign. Thomas, firstborn son, lost to the wasting sickness at age 7. Marcus, loyal friend and advisor, killed in the border wars. Catherine, daughter, died bringing her own child into the world. On and on the names went, spiraling around the stone in ever-tightening circles. Each name was followed by a brief description, a note about how they had died or been lost. As Felix read, understanding began to dawn on him like cold water slowly rising around his chest. The weight of the king's name was not pride, it was grief. Every person King Aldrich had loved and lost over his long life was carved into his name stone. Every death, every farewell, every ending was recorded there, carried with him every day, making each step a reminder of all he had outlived. The king's wife of 50 years, his 3 children, 2 of whom had died before reaching adulthood, his parents, his siblings, his friends, his mentors, his loyal servants, even his favorite horse and a beloved dog were listed there, no loss too small to be remembered. Felix sat in the forest with the king's name in his hands and felt something breaking inside his chest. He thought of his own name box hidden beneath his coat. His own name was light, so light. He had made sure of that. He had spent his whole life making sure nothing and no one could add weight to his name. He had no wife, no children, no close friends. He had loved no one, let no one close enough to matter. He had thought this made him free, unburdened, able to move through the world like a shadow. But now, holding the impossible weight of a life fully lived, a life full of love and loss, Felix wondered if his lightness was not freedom, but emptiness. The king's name was heavy because the king had allowed people to matter to him. He had loved deeply and lost painfully, and he carried every loss with him, refusing to forget, refusing to let the weight of grief make him stop loving. Felix did not know how long he sat there under the oak tree, holding the king's name-stone and reading the carved litany of love and loss. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Birds sang in the branches above him. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the sound of alarm bells ringing in the city. They had discovered the theft. He should run, Felix knew. He should take the name far from here, across the border into another kingdom where he could sell it and disappear with his fortune. That had always been the plan. But his hands, instead of returning the name-stone to its box and fastening the harness to his back, simply held it, feeling its weight, reading its words. There was a name here he recognized. Felix, brother, dead by his own hand in the 23rd year of reign. Felix the name thief stared at those words, his mind struggling to comprehend them. The king had a brother named Felix, a brother who had died young, tragically, and the king had carved this name into his own namestone, had chosen to carry the weight of this loss along with all his others. Something shifted in the thief's chest, some wall he had built long ago beginning to crack. He thought about his own life, about all the people he had deliberately kept at a distance. His mother, dead when he was young, whose face he had trained himself to forget because remembering hurt too much. His father, who he had left without a word when he chose the thief's path. The few people over the years who had tried to befriend him, whom he had pushed away before they could add any weight to his name. He had thought he was protecting himself. He had thought lightness was the same as freedom. But looking at the king's namestone, reading the evidence of a life that had touched and been touched by so many others, Felix understood that he had been wrong. His lightness was not strength, it was cowardice, and the king's weight was not burden. It was proof that he had lived, truly lived, in a way Felix never had. The sound of horses came through the forest, moving fast. The king's soldiers would be searching for the thief, tracking him down. Felix knew he had very little time. He could still run, still try to escape. But instead, he did something he had never done before in his life of theft and crime. He carefully, reverently, placed the king's namestone back into its box and closed the lid. He fastened the latch, lifted the harness, and began walking back toward the city. Every step was agony. The weight of the name seemed to grow heavier with each moment, as if now that he understood what he carried, it pressed on him even more intensely. His shoulders burned, his legs trembled, and several times he had to stop and rest, kneeling on the ground with the name box beside him, gathering his strength before continuing. The sun was high overhead when he emerged from the forest and saw the city walls before him. A group of mounted soldiers spotted him immediately and came thundering down the road toward him. Felix did not try to run. He simply stood there, bent under the weight of the king's name, and waited. The captain of the guard dismounted and approached him with drawn sword, his face hard with anger. "You dare steal from the king?" he shouted. "You dare violate the most sacred law of our land?" Felix said nothing. He unbuckled the harness with shaking hands and offered it to the captain. But the captain did not take it. He seemed confused by Felix's silence, by the way tears were running down the thief's face, by something in his expression that did not match the hardened criminal he expected to find. "Why did you come back?" the captain asked, his voice less certain now. "You could have escaped. Why return?" Felix looked up at him, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Because I finally understand what I was stealing," he said, "and I cannot bear to take it from him." The captain stared at him for a long moment, then gestured to his soldiers. They bound Felix's hands and placed the king's name box carefully onto a special cart they had brought for this purpose. Felix was led back into the city on foot, surrounded by soldiers as crowds gathered to watch the name thief's capture. He was taken to the castle and thrown into a cell in the dungeons to await judgment. The stone walls were cold, the floor damp, and the only light came from a small barred window high above. Felix sat in the darkness and thought about the names carved into the king's stone. He thought about love and loss, about weight and lightness, about the choices he had made in his life. 3 days passed before he was brought before the king. The throne room was filled with nobles and officials, all come to witness justice being served upon the thief who had dared steal the king's name. Felix was led in chains to stand before the throne, and for the first time he looked directly at King Aldrich. The king wore his name box again, the weight of it clearly visible in the careful way he held himself, the slight forward lean of his posture, the strength required just to sit upright beneath such burden. His face was deeply lined, and his eyes held a weariness that Felix now understood had nothing to do with age and everything to do with loss. "You stole my name," the king said. His voice was not loud, but it carried through the silent hall. "Do you know the punishment for such a crime?" "Death," Felix replied. "I know." "And yet you returned," the king continued. "My captain tells me you could have escaped but chose to bring my name back to the city. Why?" Felix took a breath. He had spent 3 days in his cell preparing what he would say. But now that the moment had come, all his prepared words fled. He spoke instead from the broken place in his chest, where something new was trying to grow in the ruins of his old life. "I opened your name box," he said, "and heard the gasps from the assembled nobles. I know that makes my crime even worse, but I needed you to know that I saw. I read the names carved into your stone, all of them, every person you have loved and lost." The king's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. "I thought your name was heavy with pride," Felix continued. "Everyone says so. They say you carry the weight of glory, of achievement, of your great deeds. But that's not what I found. Your name is heavy because of love, because you have allowed people to matter to you, and when they died, you chose to keep carrying them with you. Every loss is there, carved into your name, making each day harder to bear. And yet you bear it. You choose to bear it every single day." The throne room was utterly silent now. Some of the nobles looked uncomfortable, as if Felix were revealing something too private, too intimate for public knowledge. But the king simply watched him, waiting for him to continue. "My name is Light," Felix said, and his voice cracked. "So light? I made sure of that. I never loved anyone, never let anyone close enough to add weight to my name. I thought that made me free. But holding your name, feeling its weight, reading those words, I understood that I have never been free. I have been empty. And my lightness is not something to be proud of. It is something to be ashamed of." He fell silent then, having said everything he knew how to say. The king studied him for a long moment, his old eyes seeming to look past Felix's face and into his very soul. Finally, King Aldrich spoke. "You understand then," the king said quietly, "what few people do. They see me struggle beneath the weight of my name, and they think it noble, or they think it foolish. Some believe I should commission a new namestone, have it carved fresh, leave the old griefs behind and start lighter. But I cannot. I will not. Every name on that stone is someone who shaped who I am. To leave them behind would be to lose part of myself." "I know," Felix said. "I understand that now." The king shifted in his throne, and Felix saw the effort it took, the way the weight of his name made even small movements difficult. "You have committed a crime punishable by death," the king said. But you have also done something I have never seen before. You have understood, and you have chosen to return what you stole, knowing it meant your own doom." Felix nodded, accepting his fate. He thought, strangely, that he was ready for it. He had lived his whole life running, hiding, keeping his name light by refusing to connect with anything or anyone. At least now, at the end, he had learned something true that seemed worth whatever came next. "I will not execute you," the king said, and a murmur ran through the assembled nobles. "But neither can I let such a crime go unpunished. You will work in the service of the crown for the rest of your days, and you will do so carrying a special burden." At the king's signal, a servant came forward bearing a name box. It was not large or ornate, just simple wood with a leather harness. But when the servant placed it on the ground before Felix, even from a distance, he could sense its weight. "This was my brother's name box," the king said, and Felix's blood went cold. "The brother who shares your name, he died 40 years ago when he was not much older than you are now. He was in pain, struggling with demons I could not see or understand, and he took his own life. I have carried his name with me ever since, added to my own burden, but I think perhaps the time has come to pass it to someone else." The servant unlocked Felix's chains, then helped him put on the name box harness. When the weight settled onto Felix's shoulders, he gasped. It was not as heavy as the king's name had been, but it was far, far heavier than his own. His knees shook with the sudden burden, and he had to brace himself to keep from falling. "You will carry my brother's name," the king said. "You will work in the castle, helping to care for the things and people that matter to me. And every day you will feel the weight of a life lost too soon, a person who mattered, who was loved, who is still mourned. Perhaps in time you will add weights of your own to your name. Perhaps you will allow people to matter to you. And perhaps one day your name will be heavy with the evidence of a life lived fully, as mine is." Felix stood there, shaking beneath the weight of the dead prince's name, and felt tears streaming down his face. It was a punishment, yes, but it was also something else. It was a chance to learn what it meant to love, to connect, to allow his name to grow heavy with meaning instead of remaining light and empty forever. "Thank you," he whispered, though whether he was thanking the king or the dead prince whose name he now carried, he could not have said. And so Felix, the name thief, became Felix, the name bearer. He worked in the castle, at first in the stables, caring for the king's horses. The weight of the prince's name made every task harder, made each day a struggle. But he bore it, and as he worked, people began to talk to him. The other stable hands, the servants, the guards. At first he responded with his old habit of coldness, of keeping everyone at a distance. But the weight on his shoulders reminded him daily of the cost of isolation, and slowly, painfully, he began to let people in. He became friends with a stable boy named Thomas, who had a laugh like sunlight and a talent for getting horses to trust him. He learned the names of the kitchen servants who brought food to the stable workers, and after a while, he could tell by their expressions what kind of day they had had. He met a woman named Elira, who worked in the castle gardens, and when she smiled at him, he felt something warm kindle in his chest, something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Months passed, then years. The weight of the prince's name never grew lighter, but Felix grew stronger. His shoulders broadened, his legs steadied, and he learned to move through his days with the burden, to work and live, and even sometimes laugh, despite the constant reminder of loss that he carried. One day, Thomas fell ill with a fever. Felix sat by his bedside through 3 long nights, bringing water and cool cloths, talking to him when he was conscious, and simply being present when he was not. When the fever finally broke and Thomas opened his eyes and smiled weakly up at him, Felix felt the weight on his shoulders seem to shift somehow, as if the prince's name box had grown a fraction heavier. But it was not a bad heaviness. It was the weight of caring, of allowing someone to matter enough that their suffering mattered too. King Aldrich was old, and as more years passed, he grew older still. Felix saw him sometimes in the castle courtyard, moving slowly beneath the terrible weight of his name, still refusing to set down any of his burdens, still choosing to carry every person he had ever loved. The king would nod to Felix when their paths crossed, a small acknowledgement between 2 men who understood what it meant to bear weight. In the 5th year of Felix's service, Ilera from the gardens asked him to walk with her on his day of rest, and Felix said yes. They walked in the hills outside the city, moving slowly because of the weight Felix carried, and they talked about small things at first, then larger things. She told him about her childhood, about her dreams, about the small griefs and joys of her life, and Felix, for the first time, told someone about his own past, about the years as a thief, about the night he stole the king's name and learned what weight really meant. Ilera listened without judgment, and when he finished, she simply took his hand. "We are all carrying something," she said. "Some weights are visible and some are not, but no one walks through this life without bearing something." Felix thought about her words often in the days that followed. He began to notice the way other people carried themselves, the invisible weights they bore. The cook whose daughter had married and moved far away, who smiled at her work, but sometimes stared out the window with sad eyes. The guard whose hand shook from an old war injury he never spoke about. The quiet stable hand who flinched at loud noises and avoided close friendships, carrying some past trauma Felix could only guess at. Everyone was bearing something. The name boxes that the people of Nomara wore were just the visible symbol of a deeper truth. Life itself was weight, and the only question was whether you would accept that weight or spend your days trying to escape it. In the 7th year, Felix asked Ilera to marry him. It was not a grand gesture, no elaborate plan. They were in the garden, and she was showing him a new variety of rose she had successfully grafted, and he simply looked at her and knew. When she said yes, he felt his name box grow heavier, felt the weight settle more deeply into his shoulders. But he welcomed it now, understood it as proof that he was finally, truly alive. They had a small wedding in the castle courtyard. Thomas was there, now fully grown and head of the stables. The kitchen staff came, and the guards, and many of the servants who had become Felix's friends over the years. King Aldrich himself attended, sitting in a chair specially built to help him bear the weight of his name, and he smiled as he watched Felix and Ilera exchange their vows. That night, Felix carefully opened his name box for the first time in 7 years. The prince's namestone was still there, as heavy as ever, but next to it was something new. A small addition had been carved into the wood of the box itself, added by the castle's master carver at the king's request. it said, and Felix, name thief, who learned to bear what matters. Felix traced the words with his finger and felt tears on his cheeks. His name had grown heavier, was growing heavier still, and would continue to grow heavier with every person he allowed into his life, every connection he made, every love he accepted. But he no longer feared the weight. He had learned what the king knew, what anyone who truly lives must learn. The weight is the price, and it is worth paying. 2 years later, Elira gave birth to a daughter. They named her Aria, and when the name carver came to make her name box, Felix held his daughter and marveled at how light her name was, how her tiny box seemed to weigh almost nothing. A whole life ahead of her, he thought. So many chances to grow heavy with love and loss. He hoped she would embrace them all, would never try to keep her name light as he once had. But 3 months after Aria's birth, Elira grew ill. The doctors came and gave her medicines, tried different treatments, but nothing helped. She grew weaker day by day, and Felix sat by her bedside as he once had sat by Thomas's, hoping for the same miracle, the same breaking of fever, and return to health. But some illnesses do not break, and some prayers go unanswered. On a quiet morning in early spring, with Felix holding her hand and Aria sleeping in a cradle beside the bed, Elira died. Felix felt the weight of it crash into him like a physical blow, felt something in his chest tear open, felt grief pour in like ice water. His name box seemed to grow impossibly heavy, dragging at his shoulders, pulling him down. He understood now, truly understood, the weight the king carried. This was what was carved into that dark name stone, this terrible ache of loss, this emptiness where a person used to be. He could not move for hours after Elira died. He simply sat there holding her hand as it grew cold, tears running down his face, drowning in the weight of his grief. Servants came and went quietly, taking care of what needed to be done, and someone took Aria to be fed and cared for. Felix barely noticed. He was lost in the weight, crushed beneath it, unable to see how he could possibly go on carrying this burden for the rest of his life. It was King Aldrich who finally came to him. The old king entered the room slowly, bearing his tremendous weight, and he sat down in the chair beside Felix's. For a long time he said nothing, just sat there in the presence of death and grief. Finally, he spoke. "It does not get lighter," the king said quietly. "That is what people always want to hear, that time heals, that grief fades, that the weight lessens. But it does not. You will carry this for the rest of your days, and it will be heavy every single morning when you wake and remember that she is gone." Felix made a sound, something between a sob and a groan. How could he bear this? How could anyone? "But," the king continued, "you will grow strong enough to carry it, just as you grew strong enough to carry my brother's name, just as I have grown strong enough to carry all of mine. The weight remains, but you will change. You will become someone who can bear it. And you will bear it because the weight is proof. Proof that she was real, that she mattered, that your love for her was true. Would you rather have kept your name light? Rather have never known her, never loved her, never felt this pain?" Felix thought about that. He thought about his old life, moving through the world like a shadow, his name so light it was almost meaningless. He thought about these past 9 years, the weight growing gradually heavier as he learned to connect, to care, to love. Thought about Elira's smile, her laugh, the way she had looked at him like he was someone worth knowing. All of that had added weight to his name, and losing her had added the heaviest weight of all. But the king was right. He would not undo it, would not go back to lightness, even to escape this pain. "No," he whispered, "I would not trade it. I would not choose lightness over this." The king nodded slowly, as if this was the answer he expected. "Then you understand," he said. "You have learned what I spent a lifetime learning, and now you will do what I have done. You will carry her with you. You will add her name to your burden, and you will keep walking, keep living, keep allowing people to matter, because that is what the weight teaches us, that love is worth the cost always, even when the cost is grief." Felix looked down at his hands, at the ring on his finger that Elira had placed there. "What if I cannot?" he asked. "What if the weight is too much?" "Then you will rest when you need to rest," the king said. "You will kneel beneath the burden when you must, but you will not set it down. You will not carve a new namestone and try to start light again. You will honor her memory by carrying it, by letting the weight of her loss make you stronger, make you more understanding of others who grieve, make you more present for your daughter who will need you now more than ever." Aria. Felix had almost forgotten in his grief his daughter, now motherless, who would grow up without Elira's love and guidance. The weight of responsibility settled onto him alongside the weight of grief. But the king was right. He could not surrender to the burden. He had to carry it, for Aria, for Elira's memory, for himself. In the days that followed, Felix made arrangements for Elira's namestone to be added to his name box. The carver came and carved her name into the wood alongside the prince's and Felix's own. "Elira, beloved wife, gone too soon," the carving said. The weight of his name box increased dramatically, and now Felix walked as the king walked, carefully, slowly, visibly struggling beneath his burden. But he walked. He cared for Aria, learning to be both father and mother to her. He returned to his work in the stables, though now he could do less, had to rest more often, had to ask for help with the heavier tasks. Thomas and the other stable hands understood and helped without question. They had seen his grief, had watched his name box grow heavier, and they knew what it meant. Years passed. Aria grew from infant to child to young woman, and Felix grew older beneath the weight of his names. His hair turned gray, his back became permanently stooped from the burden he carried, and he moved through the world with the careful slowness of someone bearing something precious and heavy. He never remarried, though there were opportunities. The weight of Elira was still too fresh, would always be too fresh, and he found he did not want to love that way. Again, did not think he could survive another such loss. But he did allow people to matter. He was there when Thomas married and had children. He attended celebrations and mourned at funerals. He made friends and lost them to time and age and accident and illness. Each loss added weight to his name, sometimes literally, as he asked for their names to be carved into his box alongside Elira's. His name box grew larger, heavier, until it rivaled even the king's in its tremendous weight. King Aldrich died in Felix's 23rd year of service. An old man finally laid down to rest. Felix attended the funeral and watched as the king's name box was placed in the royal crypt, still bearing its impossible weight of love and loss. The king's grandson took the throne, a young man named Peter, who had been named for his grandfather's closest friend, a man whose name was carved into the old king's stone. At the funeral, Peter approached Felix and looked at his name box, at the way Felix struggled beneath its weight. "The kingdom is changing," Peter said. "Some of my advisors say we should leave the old ways behind. Let names be just sounds we speak, not weights we carry. They say it is barbaric, old-fashioned, that it holds us back." Felix looked at the young king and thought carefully before speaking. "The weight is difficult," he said finally. "It makes everything harder, but it also makes everything matter more. When you must carry the weight of your connections, you do not form them lightly. When you must bear the weight of your losses, you do not forget the people you have loved. The boxes make visible what is always true, that we are shaped by our relationships, defined by who we love and who we lose. A name without weight is just a sound, but a name with weight is a life." Peter listened and nodded slowly. "Then we will keep the old ways," he said, "at least for now, at least as long as there are people like you who understand what the weight means." Felix continued his work in the castle for many more years. He watched Aria grow up, watched her receive her first job in the castle as a junior gardener, following in her mother's footsteps. He saw her name box begin to grow heavier as she made friends, fell in love, experienced the joys and sorrows of life. He was proud of her, proud that she did not try to keep her name light, that she embraced the weight as it came. On a spring morning, much like the morning Elira had died, Felix woke to find that he could no longer rise from his bed. The weight of his name was too great, his aging body no longer strong enough to bear it. He lay there as servants came and went, as the castle physician examined him and shook his head sadly, and as Aria sat beside him, holding his hand, just as he had once held her mother's. "I am sorry," he told her. "I am sorry to leave you." "You are not leaving me," Aria said, tears streaming down her face. "You will be with me always. I will have your name carved into my box, and I will carry you with me for the rest of my life. The weight of you will remind me every day of how much you love me, how you raised me alone, how you taught me that the weight is worth bearing." Felix smiled at that. His name had grown so heavy over his lifetime, heavy with love and loss and connection. Once he had kept his name light, had moved through the world unburdened and empty. Now he could barely move at all beneath the weight of all he carried. But he would not change it. Every name carved into his box, every person he had loved and lost, had made him who he was. The weight had been worth it, all of it. "Tell me their names," he whispered to Aria. "The names I carry. I want to remember them all." And so Aria opened his name box and lifted out his name stone, struggling beneath its weight. She read the names carved there, starting with the prince whose name the king had given him so long ago, moving through Elira, through Thomas, who had died 5 years earlier of a sudden illness, through all the servants and friends and people who had mattered to Felix over his long life in the castle. Each name was a memory, a story, a piece of his heart given to another person and never taken back, even when they died. When Aria finished reading, Felix closed his eyes and felt at peace. His name was the heaviest it had ever been, and he was the lightest. He had lived fully, loved deeply, and allowed people to matter to him. The weight had been almost unbearable at times, but it had also been proof that his life had meaning, that he had been more than just a shadow passing through the world. Felix, the name thief, who became Felix, the name-bearer, who learned that the weight of love is the only weight worth carrying, died that morning with his daughter holding his hand. His name box was placed in the castle crypt, not far from the king's, and visitors who came there sometimes marveled at its size and weight, wondering what kind of life could add such tremendous burden to a name. But those who had known Felix understood. His name was heavy because he had loved without reservation, because he had let people matter to him, because he had learned that a light name is an empty life, and a heavy name is a life fully lived. And in the kingdom of Nomara, where names had weight and were carried in special boxes, there was no greater honor than to die beneath the crushing weight of a name made heavy by love. Arya added her father's name to her own name box, and she felt the weight settle onto her shoulders like a blanket, heavy and warm. She would carry him for the rest of her life, just as he had carried so many others. The weight would make her stronger, make her more compassionate, make her understand the truth that her father had learned from a dying king, that we carry the people we love always, whether in boxes strapped to our shoulders or in the invisible chambers of our hearts, and that the weight, though heavy, is precious beyond measure. The end.